All right, thank you so much, Norma, for that kind introduction, to Mark for inviting me, and to all of you for being here. And also to Joe for this lovely space. I grew up reading Asterix and Obelix, actually, so this is great. I was not expecting that. So yeah, really lovely space. I'm really delighted to be here today. Okay, so what I'd like to do today is to share with you a couple of questions that I don't have the answers to yet. They're very open-ended questions, so I'd be delighted to hear your thoughts on them too later. One of those, yes, I'll try. Okay, sure. Yes, I'll try and stand here. But one of those questions is, can literature be a form of diplomacy? You might also put that in a different way, which is, can literature do a kind of diplomatic work that more traditionally defined diplomacy cannot? And finally, another way of putting that question might be, what is diplomacy anyway? So the reason why I came to this question of literature as diplomacy is because I noticed that some of the Turkish and Chinese authors that I research engage in some very interesting things in their writing, which I think, for lack of a better word, are diplomatic. So let's look at a couple of examples. We can see if you agree or not. So I'll start with the example of Kang Youwei. So who was Kang Youwei? He was one of the most prominent thinkers and political reformers of the late Qing dynasty. Okay, so he was a very prolific writer. He had the ear of the emperor, and he's still actually a household name in China today. So one of the most influential people of his generation. One of the initiatives he spearheaded was for the Chinese empire to become a constitutional monarchy. As we all know, that did not end up happening. So when the reforms failed, Kang went into exile. So during this very long period of exile, he traveled extremely widely. So India, Sweden, Canada, dozens of countries, very impressive for the early 1900s, I think. And one of the places that Kang Youwei went to was Istanbul, which was then, of course, the political and cultural heart of the Ottoman Empire. So what does Kang Youwei get up to in Istanbul? He has a very jam-packed itinerary. So besides the Hagia Sophia, of course, and Topkapi Palace, he also visits primary schools, military academies, private residences, and he takes very meticulous notes. So we learn about all kinds of things like tuition costs and apprenticeship conditions. But the thing that Kang Youwei is most preoccupied with is the ways in which the Ottomans and the Qing are in comparably dire straits. So he was very fixated on gleaning applicable lessons from the Turks that his countrymen could learn from. And to this end, his travelogue identifies an extensive list of woes that he perceives to be common to Beijing and Istanbul, right? Like deficiencies in urban infrastructure, cumbersome taxation systems, and political and economic subjugation by foreign powers. Okay, so he's acutely sensitive to, for example, the dominant presence of the city's foreign embassies. So here's one passage that discusses this. Turkey must daily pay debt to 6 nations, £1,000 to Russia, 600 to Britain, 400 to France, 300 to Italy, 500 to Austria-Hungary, and 100 to Germany. So that's the kind of meticulous note-taking I'm referencing. Upon learning this, I realized that the disease with which the Turks are burdened is our disease too. Gazing upon these embassies, I think back to Beijing. We are, and here Kang Youwei uses a very specific Chinese phrase, 同病相怜, which literally means patients afflicted with the same illness and thus mutually sympathetic to one another. So this is a fairly typical passage in his travelogue in the sense that Kang Youwei is constantly invested in the production of sameness between the Ottomans and the Chinese. So throughout his writing, he's constantly seeking to make Turkey legible, comparable, and relevant to his Chinese readers. And I think he's also free to do so in a way that's not usually available, I think, to official diplomacy, including traditionally defined cultural diplomacy. Because I think tonally you have a much more limited range if you're an official state representative, right? It's not so accepted, I think, to say, here are all the awful things we have in common, and this is a basis for thinking about, our relationship. It's worth noting here also that Kang Youwei had a very large diasporic community of supporters, and he later prominently featured his Istanbul travel diary in his publications. So this is very much writing that's intended for a broad transnational Chinese audience. It's very much writing that's intended to influence public opinion. Okay, let's look at another moment from his travel diary. So in a rather remarkable coincidence, Kang Youwei arrives in Istanbul on the very day that Sultan Abdul Hamid II is successfully pressured into restoring the short-lived constitution of 1876. Okay, so the Sultan is kind of pressured into restoring the parliament and the constitution. This is kind of the exact moment when the city is celebrating this, that Kang Youwei arrives, right? His ship pulls into the harbor from Romania, and it's quite the arrival scene for a kind of constitutional monarchist in exile. Okay, so Kang Youwei hears that, even on board the ship, he could hear all the celebrations, and he describes what they're like, and all the jubilation, and the singing, and the drinking, and so on. But what's intriguing is that in his travel diary, Kang Youwei actually provides us with several different versions of these events. And they're all written in a very different style, with very different emphases. He doesn't explain why they're there, he just kind of lumps them all together for the reader. So the version that I find most interesting is written in the style of classical Chinese poetry. So due to kind of its rhythmic cadence, right, its poetic economy of form, this version of the events contains highly emotive language. There's a very strong emphasis on dramatic storytelling rather than documentation. So here's a line from that version written in the style of classical Chinese poetry. 苏丹无言耸具涕，一夕不寐青草之书. So we can translate that as, the speechless sultan weeps and snivels in fear and drafts documents through a dreamless night. So here we see a very different picture from the celebrations, right? The sultan as a deeply pathetic and isolated figure. So what I find very interesting here is that Kang Youwei is using poetic form to reimagine for a Chinese audience this tumultuous series of events in Turkish history. Right. Okay, so Kang Youwei actually implements a similar strategy when he visits the tomb of Suleiman the Magnificent. So when he visits the tomb, and he's sort of standing before Suleiman's resting place, he is overcome with emotion, and he supposedly also spontaneously comes up with this verse composition. Okay, so the resulting poem highlights Suleiman's kind of military exploits and glory with his current sort of faded surroundings and mortality. So Kang's ode to Suleiman is couched in the rhythms and conventions of Chinese classical poetry, complete with Tang dynasty allusions. So I think what's at play here is there's a very powerful domesticating effect of putting this kind of narrative from a completely foreign political and historical context into a very familiar literary form. And I think we might kind of think of this as a kind of historical intimacy that's created through literary means. To help us think a bit more about what the effects of something like this might be, we can turn to Hussein Banai. So he is one of the international relations scholars who have become interested in broadening how we think about diplomacy. Okay, so for Banai, state-sanctioned diplomacy is in large measure the practice of mediating state-sanctioned histories. So what's the problem with that? The problem is that often there are many competing and different narratives and histories, right? Even in Kang Youwei's account, we can see that for the same event, you can have many different ways of telling that story. And so what Hussein Banai thinks is the problem is that this kind of very narrow focus on state-sanctioned diplomacy misses out on what he calls the very important role of public imagination. So what does he define as public imagination? It's a broad term for inherited historical meanings that condition the political agency and hence culture of concerned individuals, groups, or nations in world society, or more simply, and I like the way he puts this, it's imagination with public consequences, right? So public imagination is complex, it's layered, it's subjective, it's unwieldy, it's always changing, and it's very much consequential, right? It does have consequences. So in this line of thinking, diplomacy is very much also about the mediating of public imagination. And one of the most powerful ways to do that, one could argue, is via literary means, right, such as the ones that Kang Youwei uses. Okay, I'm going to turn to my second example now, which goes in the other direction. So this is Nazım Hikmet. He is the modern poet, Turkish poet of his generation, still very much a cultural icon in the country today. You'll often see his photo up in cafes and so on. So Nazım Hikmet visits Beijing a few decades after Kang Youwei visits Istanbul. So as a young man, Nazım Hikmet goes to Moscow, where he falls in love with Soviet avant-garde art and theater, as well as with Marxism. And all these influences were to shape him indelibly throughout the rest of his life. He was identified strongly as a communist, and this very passionate affiliation was reflected in his poetry. So one of his best-loved poems, Angina Pectoris, for example, starts like this, and this is just the opening stanza. There are 3 stanzas in total. If half my heart is here, doctor, the other half is in China, with the army flowing toward the Yellow River. And every morning, doctor, every morning at sunrise, my heart is shot in Greece. And every night, doctor, when the prisoners are asleep and the infirmary is deserted, my heart stops at a rundown old house in Istanbul. So you can see the poet expresses such a strong identification here with China, with Greece, with Istanbul, that the happenings in those places manifest in physical symptoms in his own body. And it was partly on the strength of such poems, these kind of literary gestures of transnational solidarity, that Nazim Hikmet was later invited by the newly established People's Republic of China to attend the first international conference the fledgling state had ever hosted, the APC, the Asia Pacific Peace Conference, which took place in October 1952. Okay, so the ostensible main concern was over imperialist aggression in Asia. It was a really big affair, actually, with over 470 attendees, some 50 countries, lots of attendees from Latin America, so from very far away. So this was a new China, right, trying to carve out a diplomatic role for itself. Due largely to the later Sino-Soviet split, the APC is now kind of a largely forgotten or neglected peace conference. But happily, we have this periodical, World Affairs, who published a fairly lengthy interview with Nazim Hikmet during his stay in Beijing. And it gives us some interesting glimpses into how this kind of transnational solidarity was performed in person. Okay, so here's how Nazim Hikmet's interviewer describes his kind of entrance into the interview site. After only a few days in Beijing, the poet has in hand a custom-made walking cane from Wanshoushan, a traditional Chinese handcrafted ivory pipe dangling from his mouth, and if you were to visit his lodgings, you would see a pair of Chinese cloth shoes in the corner. The poet brings sentiments of friendship and an immense interest in China. So in a different way from Kang Youwei, but to similar effect perhaps, Hikmet is also engaging in a kind of production of sameness here. Now later in the same interview, Nazim Hikmet gives us an interesting anecdote about one moment in the conference. Hikmet recounts the story of when the Chilean delegation was passing by the Mongolian one at the conference, and due to lack of a common language, the Mongolians could not figure out which country the Chileans were from. Finally, the Chilean delegates uttered the magic word Neruda, and immediately the Mongolians jumped up and said, "Ah, you're from Chile." And Hikmet adds, apparently someone in the Brazilian poet Amado can truly represent all of Brazil. So besides highlighting the fact that these conferences were extremely multilingual, heterogeneous spaces in which there was rarely a shared language, and everything was chaotic mix of translation and mistranslation, these anecdotes give a sense of how at this moment nations could become legible through their representative poets, right? And how these poet delegates constituted a kind of alternative circuit to official diplomacy. So like Kang Youwei, who was in exile, Nazim Hikmet at this point in time is also in exile from Turkey. So if anything, he is the opposite of what we might think of as a state representative. He's very much alienated from the state that he is supposedly representing at this conference. Okay, what were the broader effects then of this diplomatic engagement, you might ask? So we can actually find some traces of that. So for example, there's an article published in a magazine for retired communist cadres in Sichuan province, very specific readership. It was published in 2009, so it's nearly 60 years after the APC has taken place. We have the following reader's memory. Okay, so 60 years later, this reader writes, after the APC, the translated works of Neruda, Hikmet, Tikhonov became widely circulated. It was very common to encounter their works at newsstands, at gatherings. I still remember Hikmet's poem being played as part of broadcasts at universities and schools. In those days, our favorites were the short love poems that Hikmet wrote while in prison. That famous line, "My heart's still the same heart, my head's still the same head," used to be widely known and quoted often. So I think another interesting thing that this shows is poetry, right? It's very modular, it's very portable. So one line or one verse of a poem, it was far easier to translate that, memorize that, recite that, quote it, right, compared to like a movie or a film. And so if you think of this kind of pre-internet, pre-TikTok age, right, the closest thing you had to a meme is perhaps a line of poetry, right, that would become viral in this way. So this very modular nature of poetry really lent it to it kind of being woven into the fabric of daily lives and to circulate very broadly with, I think, significant and lasting effects. Okay, I hope these two very brief examples, Kang Youwei and Nazim Hikmet, have given us something a bit more specific to think about the potential for literature as diplomacy. And later I'd be really curious to hear about maybe examples you can think of from writers you're more familiar with. But I think between these examples, we might say that literary diplomacy can take at least two different dimensions, right? One is the fact that literary form and narrative itself, so Kang Youwei's classical Chinese poetry about Ottoman history, or Hikmet's free verse linking the Yellow River in Istanbul, right? There's something about literary form itself that's able to do a special kind of diplomatic work. And then there's the other dimension, which is perhaps closer to traditionally defined diplomacy, but still distinct from it, in which poets and writers themselves, you see them kind of actively intervening, right, in conferences and other places like that, seeking to engage with foreign publics and to kind of shape international relations in particular ways. So we could say that both Kang Youwei and Nazim Hikmet use literary strategies to engage in the production of kind of historical intimacy between China and Turkey, and even beyond. They also provide us with interesting examples of literary relations in the absence of any official interstate relations. So official diplomatic relations between Turkey and China were not established until, does anyone want to guess when diplomatic relations between China and Turkey were officially established? Yes, definitely after the First World War. Yeah, so 1971, okay? So according to the conventional definition of diplomacy, and even cultural diplomacy, right, was usually kind of defined around state-driven programs, there was no diplomatic engagement then between China and the Turks until the 1970s. And yet clearly, I think in these examples, there is some sort of diplomatic-ish relation that is taking place and some kind of engagement that is taking place. Okay, with that, I will end by returning to the question, can literature be a form of diplomacy? And my suggestion is that yes, some forms of literature do engage in a kind of diplomatic work. And yes, literature has unique diplomatic capacities, right? It's a capacity to kind of remix canons and histories, to kind of fuse different nations and empires, and to enjoin domestic and international politics, as we have seen these two authors have done. All right, thank you so much.
So, are there any questions?
Can I pick up the second slide?
Yes, the second.
The question before when they visited Turkey.
Sorry, let me just try and get
Yes.
that. Is it this one?
No, where he said Turkey has to pay five
Oh,
countries.
yes, right. So Kang Youwei in Istanbul. Let's see,
Yes.
here it is.
Somebody
Yeah. Okay. So this one.
Yes, this one.
Yes.
I don't know whether he was foretelling the future. This seems to be the reality of many countries now.
Mm-hmm.
And he seemed to have captured it very well, that it's a disease things China is also faced with them. I tend to agree with you, but that if literature is properly captured, the history is then told, then a country or any community that wants to build on it will have a fair idea of where they were and where they want to go to. Because many countries, as we speak, are starting with debts.
Mm-hmm.
And debt servicing. If you don't understand where you are coming from, going ahead then becomes very, very, very difficult and difficult. That would be my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And I think Kang Youwei himself would also have agreed with the fact that this kind of debt, what do you call it, economic subjugation, was common to more than just Turkey and China. And I think it's exactly that kind of relation that's interesting because, again, if you return to kind of more conventionally defined diplomacy, it often has to focus on very cliched and positive sorts of sentiments, right? But in this case, we can see this kind of relation that is focused on something that feels like, you know, an issue that isn't necessarily packaged in a particular way, right? Literature can maybe get at these sort of very different sentiments and dimensions and possibilities of relation that sometimes state-sanctioned diplomacy is more limited in terms of what it's able to express or even consider as the grounds for thinking about how to relate to one another. Yeah, thank you for your comment.
Are there any other questions? We have one
Yeah, thank you for that question. I see what you're saying. So in the context of East Asia, for example, right, there's quite a long literary tradition of, exchanging poetry. And I think that's interesting because in that case, there's almost like a common scholarly or courtly language, which is Chinese in this case. Whereas in the case of Nazim Hikmet, something that's very interesting is happening is that none of these poets, so Neruda, Hikmet, all these kind of big figures, Jorge Amado, they often don't share a common language, so they're all reading each other in translation, sometimes, often secondhand, right? Sometimes even third-hand. So because Nazim Hikmet was writing what we might think of as a less major language, his work was often translated via Russian and then into French, or via Russian and then into English. And so one interesting thing is, I think during this moment, you have these writers expressing transnational solidarity to each other while completely, that's all navigated through different layers of translation. And sometimes that translation is actually through state periodicals. So I think there's very interesting blurring of, I'm thinking about these writers acting within the sort of less state-oriented or state-driven space, but in some cases, of course, they still have to rely on a certain degree of state-oriented circulation and publication. But yeah, thanks for your question. I think it's a very interesting thing to compare those two different moments of circulation.
Sorry, if there are no more